What makes pride? We've been taught that pride is sinful, selfish, arrogant, deadly. But we know better. Pride is not deadly, hate is. Hate is the violence trying to make us small, silent, invisible, extinct. Pride is the extravagant, unapologetic embrace of our wholeness. Pride is the affirmation of our humanity. Pride announces we are here on our own terms. And for pride to be real, it must confront all the hate that seeks to destroy. Pride must battle white supremacy. It must end poverty. It must uproot patriarchy. Pride must liberate, house, clothe, and build. I am Melissa Harris Perry, and this month I'm partnering with PFLAG, the nation's largest family and ally organization, to lead a series of conversations with BIPOC, queer, and trans folk who are organizing transformational work in our communities. Join us every Tuesday in the month of June on pflag.org. Welcome. I'm Melissa Harris Perry, and I'm your host this month for a series of conversations that we're calling What Makes Pride. Now, each week during the month of June, I'm going to be joined by leaders who are tackling critical issues facing BIPOC, queer, and trans communities through advocacy, activism, arts, and let's call it creative maladjustment. This week, we're taking up the issue of pride. When New York City police raided Greenwich Village's Stonewall Inn in the early morning of June 28, 1969, they probably expected to harass and harm the club's patrons without drawing much notice. After all, raiding sites of the queer counterpublic while subjecting queer folk to arrest and abuse was entirely routine police behavior in the 1960s. But Stonewall proved different. Patrons and community fought back, touching off a rebellion that lasted nearly a week and accelerating an uprising that persists to this day. The Stonewall rebellions were not the community's first collective act of resistance against discriminatory policing, state-sponsored violence, and economic exploitation, but Stonewall did prove decisive, marking a watershed in organizing and activism and birthing the annual Pride marches, actions, celebrations, protests, and proms that dot the globe throughout the month of June. Joining me to discuss Pride and what it means today is a movement veteran, Jay Walker. Jay has been involved in activism surrounding LGBTQ+ and HIV/AIDS issues for over 2 decades. A founding member of Gays Against Guns, Rise and Resist, Sing Out Louise, March for the Dead, and a co-founder of the Reclaim Pride Coalition and the Queer Liberation March. Walker has, let's say, helped to produce a movement. Thank you for joining me today, Jay.
Thank you, Professor. Such a pleasure to be here with you.
I'm thrilled to see you. So can we start with Reclaim Pride? What is it that needs to be reclaimed?
So much. I'm a New Yorker. I've been in this city since 1985. The first Pride march I went to was probably 1987, 1988, as I was just coming out as a young queer man. And back then it was open. Pride was open, and it was about the movement, and it was about our rights. And at that time, it was about the AIDS epidemic, the AIDS pandemic, and the public was a part of the march. One of the early chants, long before I got to town, was off the sidewalks into the streets, and that was doable. I remember I was working in the book business at the time. And my partner at the time and I saw the group of gay authors marching by, and we said, we're going to march with them. And so we just got off the sidewalks and into the streets and marched. And that was something beautiful. And that was about community. And it wasn't about splitting people up into little subsections. And it certainly wasn't about corporations and corporate logos and throwing out corporate tchotchkes to the crowd. It was really about uplifting our community. And it was the sad part is, as time went on, and as we did start uh, to gain some rights and some level of respectability, post Stephen Carrington and post all of the sort of pop cultural images of gay people, and is gay and lesbian and bisexual and trans people, were really not trans people at that point, became more socially acceptable. We became a market. We became someone the corporations could sell to. We became someone that they needed our money. They wanted our money. And so that's when we started seeing the Pride, what was a Pride March, which was a liberation march, turn into a parade with, lots of floats and go-go boys and lots of corporations and also tons of police. And then it
Because all
goes
right,
from
so
there.
all right, so I want to dig into that, but before we do, I want to pause you there for just a second, because you said some things here that I find really challenging and provocative and important. So on the one hand, I want to say a parade can still have that kind of politicizing value, right? That to the extent that shame is supposed to cause you to exit the public sphere, then we could still see sort of simply announcing, right, one's existence, right, and one's right to exist as constituting a kind of political act. So I'm interested in whether it's if it's really about the sort of like focus away from policy, or if it's about this kind of corporate, economic, I love the way you talked about it, market, and then also the policing. So let me then hand it back to you.
Sure, it's a combination of all of those factors. We had sort of this sort of simultaneous shift happening in the city around LGBTQ people, and around the way that the march was received by the general public, and the way that the city government interacted with the march. And as the march became more popular, more societally acceptable, more covered in the national media, more politicians started marching, and of course they wanted to march in the front of the march, and so they began to have this level of primacy. Then you had the police, who were having their own issues, right, with gay police officers experiencing discrimination on the job. They formed the Gay Officers Action League, which was really kind of heretical at that time, for the police force. And so then it became about having the Gay Officers Action League march. And somewhere along the line, the police marching band ended up in the parade. And that's the point where it became a little bit too difficult. In addition to that, during the Giuliani administration, we had the bike rack barricades became a huge problem with the parade, meaning that the entire length of the parade was barricaded off along the sidewalk, along the curb line, meaning that off the sidewalks and into the streets
Couldn't happen anymore, right? You can't, if you've got police building barricades there, then you actually can't get off the sidewalk and into the streets. So I can hear, I'm a Southerner, I can hear a crew of folks who are in my community who I love saying, well, what is it that he wants? I mean, do you want to be accepted or not accepted? What is the goal then of Pride? Now, I bet I have some answers, but I want to hear from you. Why would it be a problem to discover that you've got politicians in the front and the police marching band coming along behind?
Those things in and of themselves would not be a huge issue if those politicians weren't caving to special interests that were oriented against the parade. For instance, for years, the parades had lots of different routes over the years, but for a significant amount of time, it marched from the upper 50s on Fifth Avenue, down Fifth Avenue, and into down to the Village. But a problem with that was that during the HIV/AIDS crisis, that march was going past St. Patrick's Cathedral, which is the sort of living embodiment of the Catholic Church in New York City. And so what we ended up having was for a while after the AIDS activists, started doing actions in front of St. Patrick's Cathedral and on the steps of St. Patrick's Cathedral during the march. we suddenly had the elected officials deciding, okay, well, I'm going to join at 46th Street.
At the cathedral.
I'm going to join after the cathedral. That's
Oh,
what,
so that I don't have to walk past the house of the Lord
so I
with
don't have
queer
to,
folk.
so I won't be associated with whatever those AIDS activists with ACT UP are going to do in front of the cathedral. And so we had that aspect of it. But then our Black and brown, queer and trans bodies were continuing to be policed, even though we were decades after Stonewall. And so this just kept getting greater and greater. The corporate presidents kept getting larger and larger. The city began to dictate, and the police department specifically began to dictate the route of the Heritage or Pride Parade, which is the traditional. So that route kept getting smaller and smaller and smaller until in 2019, or rather in 2018, it was literally this tiny little horseshoe going from Chelsea to the Flatiron, and so literally limiting itself to 2-3 neighborhoods, whereas before it had gone in this wide swath through Manhattan to show that we are everywhere, and they just constrained it and constrained it and constrained it. Because they didn't want to deploy all of the people needed to have a large march.
So what I love about the story you've just told is that it represents in this space, in this moment, in this one set of actions, right? Actually something that is symbolic of the broader movement, right? That rather than massive resistance, right, what authorities bring instead is a kind of co-optation, a marketing, a constraint, right? And so there's still this need for reclamation from that, because that kind of co-optation does not in and of itself constitute liberation. So what I want you to do for me is set the table a bit on the most critical issues facing queer and trans communities, and particularly at that intersection of racialized, marginalized identity or immigration status. You had ACT UP at the center, right? In the story you're telling about the beginnings. What are the core issues now?
There are so many, because we are everyone, and everyone is us. And if there's one thing that our communities have embraced over the course of the last 4 years, is this sort of intersectionality in the way that activism functions now. It's the kind of the way that activism functioned in the 1970s, right? After that period of Stonewall and Black liberation and Black power, and the folks from the Gay Liberation Front after Stonewall partnered with the Black Panthers and demonstrated outside the women's prison where Angela Davis was being held. It was about marginalized people coming together. And then sometime in the late 70s to the 80s to the 90s, we all got torn asunder. And you had everyone siloed, and everyone, the environmentalists were over here, the gays were over here, the Black people were over here, the Latinx people were over there. And then suddenly in 2016, 2017, we all had a common enemy again. We all had the living embodiment of the man.
45. People bringing together people.
Bringing people together all over the place, all over the world. And so, from that resistance, I think that a lot of the queer movements sort of re-engaged with the wider population, with the wider identities, and that's what the Queer Liberation March has been about. It's been about disability rights. It's been about immigration rights. It's about trans rights, and trans rights the way they are affected by the state, and trans rights in the way that they are affected by the community. We talk about deadbeat dads all the time, not paying for their kids' expenses. What about the deadbeat parents that kick their queer and trans kids out of the house when they're underage? Nothing exists to help those kids. The carceral system, especially in relation to trans people, is a huge, huge problem. Just with misgendering, with housing people inappropriately, with the incidents of people being put into solitary confinement because the corrections officials don't know what to do. We're also dealing with immigration issues and queer and transnational relationships where For the last 4 years, prior to the current administration, they simply were not recognized. There are just a host of issues, and some of them are specifically about being queer and trans, and some of them are about being Black and the way that being queer or trans amplifies the racism that Black people are feeling, or being Latinx, or being Indigenous, and the way that things get ratcheted up because queerness and transness are a part of the story. So it's a wide variety of issues.
So part of what I'd like to sort of dig into here is one of those key issues where we've seen profound racial inequality and how that has been amplified and felt for queer and trans communities. And that's what we've all been living through over the course of the past, going on a year and a half now, the COVID-19 crisis, which includes both the contagious respiratory pandemic, but also the economic crisis, the housing crisis, the quarantine and mental health crisis, right, that have all been attendant to it. How have you seen the COVID-19 crisis operating in the communities where you're working, and what might you have learned, for example, from your ACT UP days, right? From those mobilizations in the early 1980s around HIV/AIDS?
Well, one thing that I would say that the entirety of our health and medical system learned an enormous amount from ACT UP during that period. Fauci was there, and he was the one that everybody was going after back in the day. But even he, to this, in this day and time, recognizes how much he learned about the necessity of listening to people in affected populations. We would never have gotten these vaccines authorized so quickly through emergency use had it not been for the work of AIDS activists in the 80s and 90s. It's a huge difference. But what I'm seeing in the community, it's always the case. Whenever you're dealing with any kind of pandemic, it is the most marginalized communities suffer the most. And so I hear stories from my friend Kate, who works with New Horizons, who works with queer and trans kids who are houseless because in many cases they've been thrown out of their homes, and how difficult the situation is for them to stay safe. For people living in any kind of congregate living, whether they're houseless or whether they're in prison or imprisoned, that's where you see the most need. And sadly, that's where that should be the leading edge. Anytime you have any sort of massive societal problem like a pandemic, in my opinion, you should go to the most needy. That's where you start. That is where you should begin your work, because that is where you are going to have the most harm done. That is where you're going to have the worst effects. And that's not how we do things here. That's not how we do things in this country. That's an issue of capitalism, right? If you're not someone who's spending a lot of money in the economy, then your needs are ignored. So that's what I'm seeing sort of across the board. Obviously, the homeless situation, they eventually started to do some good work with hotels and what have you. That was smart, but that didn't happen nearly early enough. It wasn't nearly broad enough. But that's an ongoing problem, right? With homeless people, with their needs not being met, with them being ignored by a system, and with having police be the first line of interaction with the government for them.
Yeah, there's somehow not surprising, in a kind of appalling way, not surprising that George Floyd was murdered in the context of the summer of the pandemic. That it is that very right sort of set of crises that lead those with marginalized identities to be right in a public space in that way, and for policing to be occurring. I want to ask you two last questions. The first one is really quick, and that is just, What do you want Pride to look like this year?
What I want Pride to look like is the way that Pride has looked like for me for the last 2 years, which is uh, everyone out in the streets together. Yes, we're in a pandemic, and so yes, wear a mask,
Mask it up.
mask it up. But the joy of what we do with the Queer Liberation March in New York every year. If your group wants to carry a banner, that's great, but you'll be right next to another group carrying another banner, and you're going to meet those people, and you're going to find out how much you have in common, and maybe you'll get a date out of it. And
Listen.
and we're going to all end up in Washington Square Park at the end for just a big fest, a big enjoyable afternoon of fun, of connection, of making those strong connections so that we continue to work for the liberation of everyone.
I love that vision of Pride. And my last question, where can people find you and how can they support your work?
Oh, absolutely. We are at Queer March on Instagram and on Twitter. It's Reclaim Pride NYC. .org on the internet, and that's where our donation link is if folks want to donate to the efforts to produce this march. We're also going to be doing a live stream for the entire period online, so people will be able to see it anywhere in the world. So yeah, and we have meetings every week that are open to everyone. You can find out more about those on our social media and on our website.
Jay Walker of Reclaim Pride New York, thank you for joining me.
Thank you so much. My pleasure.
Now, up next, we have some original music by Tomu DJ. And after our music break, I'm going to be joined by Taylor Alexander of Southern Fried Queer Pride. Stick with us because you do not want to miss this conversation. Welcome back. I'm Melissa Harris Perry, your host for a month of conversations we are calling What Makes Pride. Now, earlier we talked with Jay Walker of the New York-based Reclaiming Pride, and we got a kind of amazing story about the history of the Pride Liberation Marches through New York City. Now I want to turn your eyes to the South. In July of 2020, GLAAD released a critical new research report titled Telling a Southern Story, LGBTQ Resilience, Resistance, and Leadership. The report finds that more than 4 in 10 LGBTQ people in the South are people of color, and that more than 1 in 5 queer Southerners are Black. So what does that mean? Well, it means that BIPOC, queer, and trans folk are uniquely vulnerable to those intersecting policy harms that characterize Southern states. Things like not expanding the franchise, things like not expanding Medicaid. But at the same time, BIPOC, queer, and trans folk are leading many of the most consequential transformations of American life and politics through their work in the South. And the leaders of one of those transformational organizations is my next guest. Taylor Alexander is CEO of Atlanta-based Southern Fried Queer Pride, a nonprofit organization empowering Black, queer, and QTPOC-centered communities in the South using the arts. And they are also the mother of House of Alexander. Welcome to What Makes Pride, Taylor.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm so happy to be in this digital space with you.
I'm thrilled to share this space with you. So Taylor, let's just start in the South. I'm a Southerner. I'm coming to you right now from North Carolina. I spent a lot of years living in Louisiana. But talk to us. What makes the South different?
The South is different for so many different reasons, I think, that are constantly erased in mainstream media. I think every single Southerner is placed under a narrative of being lost in a conservative wasteland, that there's no such thing as a vibrant community, especially if you're Black and brown, especially if you're queer and trans. You're constantly confined to that narrative. And what people forget is that the South is not only a place of artistic excellence, but also just communal excellence of Black and brown people. Has a history of resistance and so many vibrant communities that have been, fighting for our rights and our, safety here in the South, but also for so many different populations across the country. So I really think that, the narrative and the true nature of the South is something that's always kind of pushed to the side.
I so appreciate that response because, I feel that as a Southerner, right? That idea that oh, it must be so terrible to be down there. And I'm like, well, that the Black colleges are down here, right? And know that our community, our land ownership is down, y'all know, it's our space as much as anybody else's, right?
Exactly.
Yeah. I mean, have y'all been to Boston? Okay. So listen. One of the things I will say, though, that is emerging in our kind of public discourse about the South right now is the Georgia saved us language, right? Thank you, Georgia, for giving us a couple senators, for turning blue on the electoral map.
Mm-hmm.
And I love this conversation. I love the ways that it has centered Black women, but it's almost exclusively, at least in mainstream media, centered presumably straight, cis Black women in that space. So I'm interested in the stories we might be missing about who else in Georgia saved us all.
Right. I think that when it's such an interesting kind of narrative when you put the weight of saving the country on Georgia. Yes, we're an amazing state. We do amazing things all the time. But sometimes what's lost in that conversation is often a inclusion of the various identities and people and populations that made that possible. Yes, it was a lot of Black women, but it was also a lot of, Black queer women, a lot of Black trans women, a lot of, undocumented folks here in the state. I think sometimes, going back to that first question about, understanding the South, is that we have so many marginalized populations that are consistently doing the work, consistently standing up and fighting for the rights of others, without recognition. And so while we say that, Georgia saved the country, we cannot say that without understanding that Black and brown, queer and trans folks save the country, undocumented folks save the country, drag performers save the country. Because I was definitely out there on several street corners telling people to vote in November and December. So, the whole entire country needs to understand that this is a multifaceted front towards liberation. And in that, rhetoric of liberation, we all have to understand that marginalized people across different identities and backgrounds are leading that change and have been for decades. So.
No, in fact, I love hearing you say that you were out on that street corner telling people to vote, because I will say one of the things I loved was the innovation that, okay, if people have to wait in line for very long periods of time, then we need to entertain folks, and we need to bring them water, and we need to have drag show, we need to have music, we need to have all those things, right? That's what good organizers understand.
Exactly.
But then the legislation came directly for you, right? Now Georgia state legislators are like, if you bring somebody water or a performance, right, while they're waiting to vote, that is, you can be incarcerated for that.
It's somewhat kind of comedic how quickly and just so swiftly legislators, specifically conservative ones, specifically Republican ones, have tried to usher in new legislation to crack down. Because I think what they really found out about the most recent elections is that they are afraid of the people who are not with them, who are not on their side. And they're afraid because we don't look like them, we don't believe in the same things as them. And so they're doing everything within their power to make sure that the various powers that we have accumulated, or the resistance that we have grown over the past few years, especially since 2016, that is something that they have no control over. And so they're doing everything within their small will to take away from the efforts that we have been doing here in Georgia. And while they might be successful in passing legislation, they cannot be successful in ignoring the power of the people, which will always trump the power of those who seek to take away power from the people.
Let's talk a little bit about one of the sites of that power. We've been talking about politics in a pretty, let's call it straightforward sense. But I really want to talk about art and the ways that you and the work of Southern Pride has really mobilized art. So I was telling you, as we were kind of getting ready for our conversation, I saw one clip of night work and ended up way down a rabbit hole, like following your work and playing it. My 19-year-old came in and was like, what is happening in your office today? So talk to me about how something like night work, right? Both visually, sonically, lyrically, is operating as a tool of organizing, as a tool of politics, as a tool of resistance?
Definitely. I think that, just hearing you say that you're listening to night work, it's just like, made my day. But I think that for me, when I first came to Atlanta, because I'm from a smaller town called Griffin, it's in the middle of Georgia. I came to Atlanta in 2011 to go to school. And when I started getting involved in the art scene and I started getting involved in the kind of organizing scene here in the city, I saw that there was kind of like this middle ground that a lot of people weren't inhabiting. There was this notion that art is for galleries or for, music venues or whatnot, and that organizing looks like this, like it's very, deeply embedded in lobbying and talking to legislators. And I think there were a lot of us in that time period who saw the potential for art to drive home a message and connect with people. Sometimes we talk about legislative jargon, and a lot of people who don't deal with that on the daily don't understand it, they disengage. And then on the other hand, a lot of people who are involved in lobbying and legislation kind of like don't have that kind of access or insight to how art is a medium for the people. And so when I started doing drag here in the city, some of my first few events were all around organizing and activism, whether it was taking to the streets for Black Lives Matter protests and doing drag performances, or, creating playlists and being a DJ for marches, or even like going to the ballroom scene here in Atlanta and doing like HIV testing and, advocacy for, the rights of people who are living with HIV. I think that a lot of people didn't see that connection. And so for me, it's always been important to use my art as much as like an expression of who I am and what I want to portray to the world, to also understand that, music is inherently political. Drag, for a lot of people who don't know, is inherently political, and that we have the opportunity to use art to bring so many different communities and people together. And that's something that I've tried to maintain within my own kind of art practice. And that's something that's at the very core of what Southern Fried Queer Pride is. You know, looking back to Stonewall, as we were just talking about, Marsha P. Johnson, Sylvia Rivera, yes, they were activists. Yes, they were trans women, but they were also drag performers who were not only, you know, doing drag to survive, but also to fundraise to get, you know, their sisters bailed out of jail, to, you know, raise money for supplies just to survive. So I think when people say that art or drag or music is disconnected from organizing or politics, I think they're not really taking a deeper look into how the two coincide and coexist.
I feel like you just said that art and politics are non-binary, and therefore we have to understand, right, those intersections.
Exactly.
All right. So I want you to do two things for me.
Mm-hmm.
The first is I want you to dig into the framework you just gave us, which is drag is inherently political. So I think some folks are going to hear that, they'll be like, of course. And other folks will be like, say what? So I want you to give us a little bit more for the say what folks.
For the say what folks, I think a lot of them are either informed by what the public says about drag or has said about drag over the past few decades, as it's kind of been more mainstream. You know, maybe they've been influenced by popular media like RuPaul's Drag Race, which, you know, personally, I think sometimes, not even sometimes, but like really, you know, deviates from involving politics or kind of like organizing education on their TV show. I think for the
TV shows.
Yes.
Yeah.
So I think for the people who don't understand that, I think they really need to know that drag, as much as it is a art form and a form of entertainment, it's deeply embedded in a idea or practice within queer and trans communities that, you know, self-expression is inherently political. Showing your true identity and showing yourself and expressing yourself in any way, shape, or form is a part of what's going to drive us closer to liberation. You know, we can't look at liberation or you know, freedom as a very binary thing, like it looks like this or it looks like that, or we have to abide by these rules to get rights, or we have to abide by these rules to get rights. We have to understand that it's a multifaceted approach. And, you know, as much as drag can be, you know, dancing in the club to Beyonce, it can also be, you know, doing a political number about respecting trans women, and it can be a political number about living with HIV. I think just as much as, you know, we have a history of music in America that has been very political, every single art form has that political potential, whether it's music, fine art in museums, drag performances, what have you, comedians. It all has a potential for radical kind of organizing.
So I know that Southern Fried Queer Pride has been working on a GoFundMe in order to purchase space and build out space. And as we begin to emerge from the COVID-19 pandemic, I'm sure, like, I know I'm feeling like I just can't wait to get back with people. How's that fundraising going? What's your vision for what that space will be?
Thank you for bringing this up. It's been something within our mission to do since we started in 2014. Atlanta, even though we are a LGBTQ capital of the country, we don't have a lot of things that other major cities have. We don't have a
decent
LGBT...
football team. Oh, sorry.
Very that. I will agree to that. I do not recognize the Falcons, even though they have a nice new stadium. But, you know, we've been organizing towards this goal of having a physical space because Atlanta doesn't have an LGBTQ center. We don't have a place where queer and trans folks across identities can meet and organize and gather and you know, experience things together. And so this is something that we've strived to do. We've tried to do it many times since we started as an organization. But I think it was something about the political and just like social climate of 2020 that made people really look towards us and look towards what we're doing here in Atlanta and across the South and really support that. So we launched a GoFundMe in June of last year, 2020. And so far we have raised around $130,000 towards the space, which is great. And we're aiming to relaunch the GoFundMe in June of this year to continue fundraising, because for a lot of us in the city, Atlanta is currently being gentrified. I may not be like a native here. I came here in 2011, but it seems like every 3 years, Atlanta's, populations, but also just, places where we congregate for community completely changes. And also COVID has really, helped in that regard of shutting down so many spaces and venues that we find community. SFQP started off doing things in DIY venues, like warehouse spaces where there wasn't any AC, but we can get like 300 people in there and we had a good time. But all of those DIY spaces are being bought out by developers, turned into Starbucks or condos.
Right.
And so we really want to harp on owning space as queer and trans people, but especially as Black queer and trans people who have so many deep roots in the South. I think sometimes people try to run from the South. We embrace the South and we want to have roots that are locked down here, not only for our generation, but for generations of queer and trans people who desperately need a space to call home, even if they may not have one of their own. So we're really hoping to bring that into fruition by the end of the year, because eventually once this pandemic lets off, it would be beautiful to have this amazing space. So we're really hoping it'll make it happen this year.
Listen, if there are philanthropists, if there are grant makers, if there are folks with deep pockets listening, I don't want you to miss what you just heard. Atlanta, Georgia, right? Atlanta, Georgia does not have a public gathering space, an LGBTQ center. Atlanta. Now, remember, we started this conversation with Georgia saved us. So let me just say, if Georgia's going to save the whole country, then maybe we could come together to make sure that space exists. And not only that, what I love, Taylor, about what you just said, because I'm kind of into land ownership, right?
Mm-hmm.
If gentrification is happening, then you better go ahead and own that piece of land, right? Because then gentrification becomes wealth creation. And I love the idea of intergenerational wealth for BIPOC, Southern, queer, and trans young people to be bought into that. I tell you what, you will be getting a donation for my household. And I certainly hope everybody else listening will be doing that as well.
Oh my God, I'm about to cry. Thank you.
I love what y'all are up to. You look, first of all, you say fried, I'm on board. So just at all points. Tell folks where they can find you so that they can support this work you're doing.
So all of our information can be found at southernfriedqueerpride.com. That's where we post all of our events. You can learn about our history, sign up for our newsletter, donate, become a monthly donor. You can also find us on social media, probably best at Instagram. We are at SFQP. On Twitter, we are at SFQPATL. And on Facebook, we're Southern Fried Queer Pride or at SFQ Pride.
Taylor Alexander, CEO of Southern Fried Queer Pride. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you so much for having me. This was amazing.
Great. Oh, I loved having you. That's it for this episode of What Makes Pride, brought to you by PFLAG, the nation's largest family and ally organization. I'm your host, Melissa Harris Perry. Thank you for joining us, and remember to tune in for next week's episode. It'll be on Tuesday, and I'll be talking about issues of housing justice with some extraordinary activists. To learn more about our guest from this week's episode and how to support their critical work, go to pflag.org. There you will find links and suggested ways to support and to get involved. Okay, y'all, stay safe now, be good to one another, and have a little pride.